if I hadn't have started drinking at 14, I would have almost certainly suicided by 17. I had an elder brother who died in my father's arms when the babe was only 6 months old. And my mother and father both suffered what you'd term nervous breakdowns as a result of the death of that child. And then they had about 2 or 3 miscarriages, and I got born on Christmas Day 1944. And I remember my mother would say, "Do you see the brightest star in all of the skies?" And she'd say, "That's your brother Rodney." Well, there is the brightest star in all of the skies, my brother Rodney. And I'd think, fuck me. I mean, I realised I had a burning resentment against this poor dead brother, because how can you compete against the brightest star in all of the skies? My dad and me, and my mum and me. Here's a photograph of my mum, Edna, when I was 2.5 years old. Look how sad she looks. My prime drug of addiction was alcohol. And it's not an accident that the tablets that I took were barbiturates. And alcohol and barbs are both depressants, but their fundamental role is to hold down feelings. Or their fundamental role for people like me is to hold down all these terrible feelings that as a child I just couldn't deal with. How could I? How do you deal with your mum and dad both trying to kill themselves when you were 10 or 11 or 12? And so I don't regret finding alcohol, but of course, after a while it didn't work. And I finished up in a lot of mental hospitals. I got sacked from 2 universities here in Australia when you had to interfere with the Vice-Chancellor's dog to get sacked. Well, they sacked me twice. And I finished up in America on a Fulbright scholarship, largely based on my fluency in Russian. Now, I can't say fart in Russian. I was there for 3 years. If you added up all the time I was in the one mental hospital, always for alcoholism and drug addiction, I was in hospital for 1.5 years. But the illness of alcoholism kidded me that I was in control. Aren't I clever? Manipulating these mugs and idiots into giving me free board and lodging, and then I'd have another power station full of electricity through my head. So I had a lot of ECT, a lot of shock therapy. And alcoholics often don't fit in with other mental patients. And I was on my own in the bed, and this bloke came in and said, "Hey, Aussie, the first man's about to walk on the moon." And my response was, who gives a fuck about that? Had Christ come down on a green watermelon, I would have said, who gives a fuck about that? I had no capacity to think outside of myself or to see outside of myself. Alcohol never made me feel better than other people or as good as other people. What it did was to hold down the pain of being myself enough for me to survive for a while. I knew intellectually that I was not a bad person, but that didn't take away the terrible sense that the past was going to come and catch me up for all the dreadful things I'd done to other men and women. And the last time I tried to kill myself in America, I finished up getting sent home to Australia because the Americans, and I think it still applies in the state of Ohio, if you make more than 2 notifiable suicide attempts, they get very sick of paying the hospital bills and they work out it's cheaper to send you home. Poets are damned, but we are not blind, for we see with the eyes of angels. I got sent home early in 1969, and it took me until Australia Day 1970 to stop drinking alcohol and to stop using other drugs as well. And since then I've had nothing in my blood but blood. This is when I got my PhD at the University of New South Wales. I'm prone to depression to this day, but going to the meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous gives me a great sense of usefulness. And I certainly wasn't useful when I was drinking or using. I can't imagine a doctor saying, look at that Ross Fitzgerald in that room there. What a tremendously helpful and youthful person he is. I used to think that I was a writer, but when I was drinking, I didn't write a note to the milkman. Since I've been sober, not for the first 3 years, but I've now just finished proofing my 38th book. They're not War and Peace, but they're there. Recovery is a wonderful thing, and the recovery walk that Bill Crews and myself and other people have been involved with, I think it's important to make it clear to the community and to politicians that there is a way out.
One of the reasons for today's walk is that when alcoholics and addicts are using, we often hit the headlines. But as soon as we stop using and stop drinking and go into recovery, we fade from sight. And that means that other sick alcoholics and addicts don't know that there's hope for them and that there is the possibility of real recovery from addiction.
I often say, every problem I've got is AA's fault. I wouldn't be worried sometimes about my wife's health. I wouldn't be concerned about our daughter, Emerald. I wouldn't be worried about the latest novel that I'm just proofreading. Because if it wasn't for AA, I'd be dead.